With businesses starting to reopen, there are some employees who might be feeling a little anxious about going back to work in the midst of a pandemic.
Here with the answers to some of your most frequently asked questions is employment and labor lawyer Lior Samfiru. And Lior, let's begin with the situation in Manitoba, where civil servants are being asked to take unpaid vacation. Is it voluntary, and what are their rights?
That's a great question. An unpaid leave that's mandated, we have a different name for that, and that is a layoff or a temporary layoff. So if you've been told you have to take a leave, you've been laid off temporarily. For most employees, their employer actually does not have a right to lay them off temporarily, meaning they could treat that as a termination. So the choice is either treat that as a termination and pursue termination entitlements, or accept it. Just make sure you tell your employer it's a one-time thing. You're not going to agree to it in the future. You really don't want to set a precedent for these things to happen again.
All right, meantime, Lior, a lot of employers are being asked to go back to work, and maybe some of them don't feel exactly safe going back into the workplace. What are workers' rights if they feel unsafe or unsure about going back to work during this time?
The most fundamental right that all employees have is to be safe at work. So their employer must take all precautions necessary, the precautions that are stipulated by governments to ensure social distancing and other measures to ensure safety. Now, if in fact those measures are taken, an employee does have to go back to work in most circumstances. The employee may still feel unsafe or unwilling to risk it by going to work, but they still must go to work. The concern is if they decide not to go to work, they may be deemed to have resigned, so they lose their job, and they also then may be cut off from the government benefits like the CERB. Now, if you have a doctor's note or you have childcare obligations, that may be very different. But most employees have to go to work if safety precautions are being followed.
What questions should employees ask their employer before they return?
It is very important that questions be asked. So first of all, I would have employees ask, well, what safety precautions are being taken? What have you done to ensure social distancing? What measures have been put into place? Beyond that, I'd want employees to ask, what happens, employer, if in fact there is a case of the virus in the workplace? How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to inform individuals, and how are you going to ensure that it doesn't spread? Those are important questions, and employers have to be prepared to answer those. And where employers cannot answer those, frankly, they should not be opening.
All right, we keep hearing time and time again, Lior, the key to a reopening and a successful and safe reopening is testing. And part of that testing has been temperature checks at some places of business. Do employees have to submit to a temperature check from their employer if asked to do so?
So certainly employees cannot be physically forced into submitting to a test. But that said, employers can tell employees that if you're not going to go through the test, then we cannot have you in the workplace. Now, for that test to be proper, it cannot be stored or distributed in any way. It can only be used for the purpose of ensuring that someone doesn't exhibit symptoms of the virus. So yes, an employer legally can have a test. It's not a breach of any law, but of course, an employee has to consent to it, and we have to ensure that that data is stored so there's no privacy breaches.
All right, let's talk worst case scenario. An employee returns to work and gets infected with COVID-19. What do they do then?
Well, first of all, obviously, an employee like that would want to inform their employer, potentially other coworkers, to ensure that people know and that there's less likelihood of a spread. Now, for those employees who may have the virus and now cannot work, have to self-isolate, they're going to experience a loss of income. They could then apply for workers' compensation benefits in the province where they work. In most cases, they'll be able to get that if that was something that they got at work. Now, I've been asked, can you sue your employer? In most cases, you cannot. That's what workers' compensation is for. But it's about informing your employer, informing coworkers, and then the ball shifts to the employer to ensure that others are protected, even if it potentially means closing down the business for some time.
All right, Lior, certainly our work has changed over the last couple of months. A lot of people doing exactly this, working from home, on Zoom, on FaceTime, on Skype, that sort of thing. Some people's hours have changed, that they're maybe not working an 8-hour day or they're working every other day. When we get back to some sort of new normal, can those changes, can they become permanent?
Now, Jeff, that's an extremely important question. Let's start with the idea that an employer, despite the pandemic, does not have a right to make significant unilateral changes to terms of employment. So your employer cannot reduce your pay significantly by more than 10%. So if your employer does, you have a choice. You can accept that change and continue working, or you can treat that as a termination and require them to pay severance. Now, the concern here, as you've said, is if you accept that change, you may then be deemed to have accepted it for good, and then you may be stuck not getting your pay increase. So at a minimum, what employees should do, if they're going to accept a pay reduction or other change, should put it in writing to their employer that I'm only accepting this on a temporary basis, and I expect to be back to normal as soon as possible. That gives the employee some measure of protection, but that is a real concern that these changes may become permanent.
Some really important and great information. Lior, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.